Good morning to my church family. We continue in our series on the Gospel of Mark. It's hard to believe that we are actually halfway through the Gospel of Mark now. This is an action-packed gospel. We talked about that in the earlier days in this. You see him going from one event to another. Time is passing quickly here. And I can imagine that even for Jesus, things are maybe, he thinks that time is passing quickly as well. His ministry is only about 3 years long, and he's about halfway through it. And you know he's got to be worried a little bit about, is he making the impact on these disciples that he needs to make? He knows he's got to get this done. He's only got a short amount of time to do it. And that's where we are here in chapter 9, where we'll be today, if you want to grab your Bibles. But to go into 9, I want us to back up to chapter 8 and look at the very last part of it. There in chapter 8 it says this: He began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be killed. End of Mark 8, beginning of Mark 9, we turn Jesus' ministry towards Jerusalem. He's halfway through his ministry, and now everything starts pointing towards Jerusalem. He starts talking to his guys. He starts teaching his guys that he's going to have to die, and he's going to have to be going to Jerusalem and go to the cross and the Passover there. These teachings start to have a different impact on these guys, his disciples, but I think it also has an impact on Jesus himself. He's also preparing himself for what's going to happen. Being fully God, he understands what's coming in Jerusalem, but also being fully man, he knows what's coming in Jerusalem, and he's dealing with all those thoughts in his mind. Don't discount either one of those, the fully God or the fully man. As a God, he knows he needs to go and make this sacrifice for the sins of the world. But the human side of him, and maybe even the God side of him, he dreads that taking on the sin of the world and that separation that he knows is coming from his Father. So we've turned toward Jerusalem now, and in Mark chapter 9, and this is the very first thing that happens. Mark chapter 9, we'll start reading in verse 2. After 6 days, Jesus took with him Peter and James and John and led them up on a high mountain by themselves. And he was transfigured before them, and his clothes became radiant, intensely white, as no one on earth could bleach them. And there appeared to them Elijah with Moses, and they were talking with Jesus. And Peter said to Jesus, Rabbi, it's good for us to be here. Let us make 3 tents, one for you and one for Moses and one for Elijah. And he did not know what was to say, for they were all terrified. And a cloud overshadowed them, and a voice came out of the cloud, This is my beloved Son, listen to him. And suddenly, looking around, they no longer saw anyone there but Jesus. And as they were coming down the mountain, he charged them not to tell anyone what they had seen until the Son of Man had risen from the dead. So they kept the matter to themselves, questioning what this rising from the dead might be. And they asked him, Why did the scribes say that Elijah must come? And he said, Elijah does come first to restore all things. And how is it written that the Son of Man, that he should suffer many things and be treated with contempt? But I tell you that Elisha has come, and they did to him whatever they pleased, as it is written of him. We call this the Transfiguration. This event is also recorded in Matthew 17 and also in Luke 9. And I'm going to take us a little bit into Luke 9 and a little bit into Matthew 17 so we can get the full context of this today. Luke tells us that Jesus takes Peter, James, and John with him up on a mountain to pray. And I think that was his habit a lot of times. Jesus begins to pray, and the other guys go to sleep, is what Luke tells us. Jesus starts to pray, and he's changed as he prays. He's transformed. It's our word metamorphosis. Mark says his clothes became radiant, intensely white, whiter than anyone could bleach them. Luke says it this way: as he was praying, the appearance of his face changed, and his clothes became as bright as a flash of lightning. If I were there, can't imagine what that must be like. If I were to use the term the Shekinah glory of God, would that ring a bell with you? That Shekinah glory of God is the glory of God that would descend to the Holy of Holies in the tabernacle and descend into the Holy Holies of the temple. It was the Shekinah glory of God that filled Solomon's temple when it was dedicated. It was the Shekinah glory of God that was on Mount Sinai. As Moses beheld all that, when Moses came down, his face would glow because he had been in the presence of that Shekinah glory of God. That Shekinah glory is where we are today. Jesus takes on that glory again. And I want you to remember that word again. It'll come into play as we get into our lesson. This is one of those accounts I think it'd be incredible to be there. I just don't think you'd ever recover from seeing all this. Can you imagine being Peter, James, and John after they get up from their nap and what they see? We don't hear much from James and John, but we always hear from Peter. It's almost like he can't contain himself. He's excited, he's scared, and that nervousness just pours out. And he says, I think we need to build something. I just think that's hilarious that he feels like he needs to build something, a tabernacle. I'm not sure why. Maybe he thought he needed to stay on that mountain a little bit longer, and I can understand that. Sometimes we're like that. We just feel like we need to do something rather than just be there. If you go to Mount Tabor today, which is where a lot of people think this took place, somebody actually did build a tabernacle up there. There's a church up there, and there's a dome for Christ, and on either side there's one for Moses and one for Elijah. It's a beautiful building. For a Jew, for Peter, James, and John, it doesn't get any better than this. You got Moses and Elijah, two of the big, heavy hitters of the Old Testament. The only thing that can make it better is if Abraham was there, I guess. But how did they know this was Moses and Elijah? That's an interesting question. Maybe it was the Spirit. Maybe they had their synagogue pictorial directory. I don't know. But they knew instinctively this was Moses and Elijah, and I think that's incredible. Can you imagine the impact this had on these guys? Being able to see Jesus and Moses and Elijah there. There's some powerful theology going on here. Jesus is on par with Moses and Elijah, but some of the gospel writers indicate that it was Jesus that was transformed. It was Jesus had the Shekinah glory and not necessarily Moses and Elijah. And I think the theology here is that Jesus is superior to Moses and Elijah, and that's what those guys took from that, and that's what they saw. The prophecy uses that language that Elijah has to come before the Messiah comes, and Jesus starts talking to him about that. In Matthew 17, it says that the guys started to understand that he's talking about John the Baptist and that John the Baptist was Elijah that came. He's making progress with these guys, and that's so good. Progress is being made as they understand. The disciples benefited greatly from this, understanding that Jesus is going to die, but they're confused by that. Over in verse 9, it says, as they were coming down the mountain, Jesus gave them this order not to tell anybody until they had seen the Son of Man rise from the dead. And they kept the matter to themselves, discussing what does it mean for him to rise from the dead. Jesus is starting to teach them a little bit differently. He's starting to think a little bit differently about things. So there was tremendous benefit for Peter, James, and John there. It's interesting, if you go to Peter's second book, 2 Peter, this is out of chapter 1. It says, for we did not follow cleverly devised stories when we told you about the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ in power, but we were eyewitnesses of his majesty. We received honor and glory from God the Father when the voice came to him from the majestic glory, saying, this is my Son whom I love, with whom I am well pleased. We ourselves heard this voice that came from heaven when we were with him on that sacred mountain. Years later, Peter is still incredibly moved, incredibly touched, incredibly changed because of what happened on this mountain. And I can understand that. I can just only imagine how much that affected him. But there's somebody else in this story that I think was deeply benefited and deeply changed by what happened on this mountain, and that's Jesus himself. God, in midstream of Jesus' ministry, about halfway through his ministry when he's turning towards Jerusalem, he knows what Jesus has been through, and he knows what Jesus is going to go through, and knowing what's to come, he does this incredible thing on this mountain for his Son. Sometimes we forget about the humanity of Jesus and what it's like for him to be fully human and fully God. Philippians 2 talks about he emptied himself and took on human form. He was tired, he was abused. You think about Jesus becoming discouraged and maybe even frightened. It says he was tempted in all cases like we are. That tells me, yes, he gets tired. Yes, he gets abused. Yes, he gets discouraged. And I love that God the Father does this for his Son here, knowing that in the middle of his ministry, that he's facing the cross, God speaks to his Son and says this, I affirm you. I'm going to give you courage. This is my Son. I'm proud of you. You can do this. Hang in there. He reaffirms his relationship with his Son at just the right time. There is power in the spoken word of an affirmation. Don't ever discount that. Don't discount that with your own kids. Our sons and daughters and our wives and everybody needs to hear an affirmation of the spoken word. God says, this is my boy. I'm proud of him. Don't forget I'm with you. You can do this. We all need that. And the other thing that God does here for his son is he sends them some helpers. He sends Christ some helpers. He sends Moses and Elijah, two of these big guns from the Old Testament. There's a one another aspect of all this community part, that Jesus himself needed somebody to come alongside of him in this particular time to give him encouragement. If you look over in Luke 9, it's an interesting verse in 31. It says, Moses and Elijah appeared talking to Jesus. They spoke about his departure, which he was about to bring in fulfillment at Jerusalem. What were Moses and Elijah talking to him about? What it's going to be like to die. What it's going to be like when you depart this place and go home. They reminded him of what life will be like when he returns to heaven, when he returns to live with his Father. Moses and Elijah were there to encourage him as he approaches his death. And I love that God did that for him. But also reminds him of what life was like in heaven before he left and what life will be like when he returns. For just a moment, Jesus is back in glory, the glory he had before his earthly birth. That was the strength in him for what lies ahead. I found this quote that I love about the transfiguration. It says this, for just a moment he is transfigured, a roaring radiance pours from him. He becomes as he was before he came. For one brief shining moment, the burden of humanity is lifted. Decarnation occurs. He is elevated above earth's horizon and escorted into the eternal. He is home again. Familiar sounds surround him. Those who understand him welcome him, and the one who sent him holds him. Just for a moment, he is with his Father in glory again. Jesus needed to be reminded about going home, and that home is ahead of him. Peter reminds us of that in his writings later in his book when he talks about that we are aliens and strangers here, that this is not our home. I'm wondering if Peter got that from this mountaintop experience where Jesus was reminded about going home. Here's another quote for you about the transfiguration, about going home. It says, the only ultimate disaster that can befall us, I have come to realize, is to feel ourselves to be at home here on the earth. As long as we are aliens, we cannot forget our true homeland. Unhappiness on earth cultivates a hunger for heaven. By gracing us with a deep dissatisfaction, God holds our attention. The only tragedy is to be satisfied prematurely, to settle for earth and to be content with this strange land that we're living in, to be so comfortable in Babylon that we forget Jerusalem. Boy, I don't want to do that. I'm longing to go home and be with my Father again. We have so many songs in our book about going home and about being pilgrims and strangers here and travelers. One that's not in our book, one of my favorite entertainers is Mark Lowry, and he has this song called Home Where I Belong. I'm going to quote a couple of verses for you here about this idea of encouraging Jesus at this very difficult time in his life by reminding him of what home is going to be like. Mark Lowry's song says this, they say that heaven's pretty, but living here is too. But if they said I had to choose, I would choose between the two and I would go home. I'd go home where I belong. I have that homesick feeling in my eyes. I'm going home where I belong. I'm here, but not for long. And when I'm feeling lonely and when I'm feeling blue, it's just a joy to know that I'm only passing through. I'm headed home where I belong. The older I get, the more I feel that tug that this world is not my home. And I want that for me, and I want that for my family, and I want that for you, that we realize that this earth is not our home. And I hope that we have people in our lives that can come along and encourage us when we're in those disappointing times, when we're in those valleys, and they can come along and say, you know what, just remember, we're not home yet. Mark 9 is an incredible chapter of this transfiguration. There's a lesson in here for the disciples about Jesus and about Moses and Elijah, but I think this miracle was done for Jesus and not by Jesus. He needed encouragement from his Father. He needed to be reminded about going home, and I love that. I love that God did that for his Son. God bless you in your studies.